Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Kubernetes Cluster API Azure, our weekly office hours meeting. It is August 8th, 2024. As you probably know, we're a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and therefore we follow the general Kubernetes community rules of conduct, which boil down to essentially treat other people as you would like to be treated. Let's try to use the raise hand feature in Zoom so that we don't talk over each other. And let's make this a welcoming, productive time. At the beginning, is where we usually allow new attendees to introduce themselves if they want to. So I'll be quiet for a minute here, and please feel free to unmute and just say howdy if you want.
Hello, I'm Brian. I work with Red Hat. I'm looking to get more involved with Cluster API Azure as we're working on a project jointly with Microsoft.
Cool, welcome, Brian. All right. Let's move on. We actually don't have anything specific on the agenda yet. That doesn't necessarily mean we don't have anything to talk about. So if anybody has any questions or topics to discuss, let's do that. Otherwise, we might end up going through the milestone, and nobody wants to do that for now. David's nodding his head. Yeah, we're doing that. All right.
We have a nice and interesting scenario of only one item left in the 117 milestone. So
Oh
that
yeah.
and we have another month left to go. So that's an opportunity I see.
Cool. All right. Well, let's just switch over to that. This is kind of inside baseball, in that we're going to look at individual issues and PRs and stuff. So if people want to drop, please feel free. Or if a question comes to mind, please feel free to interrupt us. So let's go do that. So 117 is the next one, which is September 17th, and we only have one thing in here. Oh, and yeah, and this is a PR that we should be able to move forward. I took a look at it, it seems reasonable, and then we have a community member who's been very invested in rehabilitating this, and I think it's gonna. So yeah, I think this is in the right place, unless someone has some other knowledge. Let's just leave that there, and then I guess we probably have a bunch of stuff to add. Do you want to look through the next here? Start here, or do we have PRs in the queue? I guess we'll just start here. Configure controllers to watch ASO and reconcile requests for. John is not here, but people have opinions on this. David, do you think we should keep this in the milestone or let it sit here?
I mean, I think it's candidate. I think John was saying it's like a day of work, but we've had issues in the past where there's kind of requeuing or like there's delays, like there's other kinds of things for synchronization. And I don't know, this might help a little bit with that in terms of the efficiency of the reconciliation process. So
Okay.
it's not critical, but I think it would be nice to have.
Well, we still have, you know, almost a month and a half, so let's be optimistic and see if it can do it, I guess. Um, Out of tree credential provider for all templates. This is still not a thing. Sorry. Let's zip down to the bottom and see what the current status maybe is. Oh yeah, we merged that one in Image Builder. Actually, now I know what he's talking about. Um, so I guess he's suggesting we should take these. Go ahead, Jack.
I would vote to close the issue just because for folks building their own images, having the reference templates with the reference, this is how you download binary. Unless this is purely is this going to travel to any use cases, any customer use cases, or is this just for testing custom builds of cloud provider with custom builds of CapZ?
I mean, the bug describes all templates, and I think we've done that. And they're just saying that we could stop specifying the binaries in the template and fall back on and assume they're on the disk image already.
But again, this is for non-release stuff, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Like when you integrated that into Image Builder, I imagine it was in order to make it easier to test certain. Actually, do you remember which versions um, of the credential provider binary and config? Like what's getting baked into the image? Is it a particular version of the cloud provider stuff that correlates with the particular version of Kubernetes?
It should be. It should come along with the version of Kubernetes, I think. So that is probably better because then it's all in the same build family.
Yeah, I think we for sure we should close this issue, and then we should maybe can we in 30 seconds decide whether or not to create a new issue with this reduced scope and put it in the backlog, or
Yeah,
because the support OT credential provider for all templates, as your
yeah,
initial reaction suggested, that's already been done.
sure. Okay.
I would just put it back on them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna leave this open though because I don't know if it's really on them to create the issue. I think we could do that just because it was Cecile's suggestion. So she is still us. That's the way I see it. Sorry, I got lost here. Oop, wrong one. Add UX. Oh wow, yeah, this is still open. This is a hot potato that Jack took most recently, I think, but I don't know what this really means at this point.
Yeah, this is not going to be part of this milestone. So
Okay.
for folks
Well,
in the community, we're currently figuring out how to do internal testing, which won't allow us to do which won't allow us to use workload identity with kind, which is what I believe this is referring to.
So should we let it sit, or do you want to close it?
It's happy to be in the backlog. Yeah. I just don't
Okay,
anticipate that we would do that in the next few weeks.
that's good. Native support for auto scaling from 0. I guess this doesn't quite work still. Short and sweet. Do we think this is something we want to get to? Maybe.
I don't
Michael
really
will
know what
get
the
to it.
scope of this is. That's confusing that CapZ would have a native story here. But we could look into it in the backlog. The reason I
So,
say that is because all this stuff happens at the cluster API resource level. So if there are reference templates that don't have the correct annotations, that wouldn't fall under native support. So maybe we can just ask Michael for more clarity here.
um, I can see native support
I
require
mean,
adding status.
he does seem to be suggesting the API needs to be evolved. I just don't quite understand what the scope is here.
Yeah. Um, Well, I don't know. Do we have a good question to ask, or should we just let it sit where it is? Kind
Yeah,
of up
maybe
to
you
you.
could just ping Michael and ask if he has chance to do this, that we would happily review it.
Okay. I guess we got both of those. I'm still stuck on this one. I have not been able to figure out a way through Calico. I think it would still be really cool, but uh, I'm kind of hesitant to add it to the milestone. So I think I'd like to just let it sit here for now. Um, document how to run management server using AKS with workload identity. I think we should. What do you think, David? Seems like
Yeah, I mean, actually, I have this
priority.
now working with AKS platform engineering repo, but it's using Terraform, so it shouldn't be that hard to add in. You can put it in there.
Okay. Um, this one, this one I will get to. I made several feints at it, and then John had some good suggestions, and I think I know what to do now. It's a little more work. Uh, we don't do an upgrade test with managed clusters.
Yeah, I think this should be added to the milestone.
Right on.
Yeah, we've
It's
been bumping
pretty.
this for a while, and we've actually had at least one case where this didn't work before. So
That sounds like good enough reason.
Yeah, that is my bad. I'll get to it ASAP.
Oh, no worries. It's not like that. We are all overburdened. This goes along with that other issue, so I'll put it on the milestone as well. And FAQ to AKS, TLA.
I think that this one, I don't know, I debate on just even closing because I think that with the issue that I have linked there, improve UX for Azure ASO managed cluster, I think it'll be more obvious like what what you need to do there, because that should updates to that documentation should explain like, hey, I want feature X, I want feature Y. But I think the FAQ is maybe, I don't know, it's explicit that that's what we need in there. So I don't know.
We have it as a subtask of this kind of
Yeah,
epic issue.
right.
But,
Yeah,
well, it's up to you if you think there's still,
you
I don't
can.
know.
Yeah,
Leave it
I mean,
open, leave it on the put it on the milestone.
you can put it on. Yeah, and just we'll see if we can
Okay.
try and get it in.
All right. So that's all we had in the next milestone. Let's see. I don't necessarily want to visit all these, but so why don't people flag down the ones that seem.
I did send posted in chat one issue that I'd like us to look at.
Oh, sorry. Let me find chat.
Okay.
There it is. Okay.
Just because we've been working in this space a lot, I just wanted to try and again like get an idea of where we're like what we're thinking or what we're doing with this or not.
So is this still the hitch?
Nothing at the moment.
Yeah.
I'd love to see some more clarity around security benefits and or user requests around this. just because the former in particular is more of a moving target than I would like in order to commit to this. So I want to feel more confident that this is actually the right story.
You just leave it. That's fine. Yeah, you commented it's gonna refresh the status, but I just wanted to get at least a verbal update. So that's fine. You don't have to put anything. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. Okay. Any candidates here? There's quite a few.
Man,
Bug
maybe
stuff.
I think maybe bug stuff that relates to managed stuff would be interesting to triage.
AKS, happy VM provisioning fails intermittently, but often because of the Windows bootstrapping. As soon as the provisioning, so we don't have much info. Yes. James said that's probably not the problem. So I guess we're waiting for them to follow up with some. So I'm just going to leave this one. People agree? All right. Failure domains don't. Oh, this came up during our community infra migration. Basically, we had some incorrect logic about calculating availability zones. So this is still a problem. But how big is the splash damage on this? Is this something we should definitely put on the milestone or leave it in the backlog? I'm not really sure. I know it kind of hurt us in some of the tests, but I don't know if it's a pervasive thing. I'm not looking at chat.
I'm not sure this is actually still an issue. I would just ping John to get clarity.
Okay.
Maybe just ping him on the issue because I know you did merge. It had a PR jack in here that was related to
That's
this.
definitely what I mean. Yeah. Yeah, and it didn't do anything, and I closed it, and the symptom that we were seeing no longer worked. But yeah, I would ping John
Okay.
on the issue.
Okay, I can type. Cool. I invited us to be interrupted, and I see that you are finally looking at chat. So maybe let's pop back to actual questions. I'm going to get your name wrong. Subasis?
Yes. Hello, Matt. Hello, everyone.
Hey. Go for it.
Sure. So this is my.
I'll put
Yeah.
your question in here as you, because I know you didn't have access.
Sure. So I have. Can I go, Matt?
Yes. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sure. So I have two questions. One related to third-party Calico specific networking plugin, and the other one related to VNet peering on management and workload cluster. Uh, which one you think is the right forum to ask? Because I posed this question on the Slack channel, and I was being advised the Calico will go to the Calico group, and the Azure specific thing will go to the Azure group. So is this the correct forum? Should I still go for it?
Sure.
Okay. So we are looking to do some proof of concept by using the CAPI CAPC created template, cluster template to have first the management cluster created, and from within which we are looking to have the cluster CTL provisioning the many workload clusters. Now, there is a hard requirement where we are not looking to use the network plugin as Kubernetes, neither network plugin as Azure CNI, but Calico. Kind of bring your own Azure CNI network plugin. And the company has chosen to use the network plugin. When we do that, we also do understand there is a attribute called network plugin in the cluster CTL generated CAPZ based template. We were doing some guesswork. Should we set this to none, by virtue of which neither the Kubernetes nor the Azure CNI based networking plugin will get auto configured. Rather, it will give an allowance for us to install the third-party Calico network plugin specific binaries on the unprovisioned or yet to be ready state kind of cluster based installation of Calico. So first confirmation we need is what is that specific value in these specific use case we are looking to, or we should be setting to that network plugin attribute in that template. Is it none or something else?
Okay, Jack, you want to grab that?
So I assume this is a workload cluster configuration and you're using AKS workload clusters. Is that right?
That is correct. I mean,
Okay.
This is first the management cluster, Jack, and then from within that management cluster, we'll create many workload clusters. And this management cluster functionally looking to provision the workload cluster, so to speak. But all
So
are
what is the question? Are you talking about how to configure the management cluster for bring your own CNI or your AKS workload clusters?
the management.
I'm a little surprised that there is in a network plugin
There are in fact
property for the management cluster. What resource are you referring to?
this is Azure managed control plane.
That's not the management cluster. That's the configuration for an AKS workload cluster.
Yeah, we are moving after we create the workload cluster. We are moving and making that as a management cluster so that it can.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, well, but for the purposes of this conversation, it's still the same. The answer to your question is an AKS answer. So the first thing I would suggest you do is you hop onto the new API, which is going to be Azure ASO managed control plane. Let's see.
Operator.
Yeah, because this will grant you access to a closer set of the full full AKS feature set. So the answer to your question as to how to configure an AKS cluster to accommodate bring your own CNI is really a question that you'll have to find from the AKS reference documentation. And then you'll want to correlate that answer with the ASO APIs for AKS. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I need one clarification, Jack, if I may. So as of now, we were only fixated with the idea of not using the ASO, but the cluster CTL generated the obvious CAPZ template, the YAMLs. And there we saw in, I think, V1 beta API specific specs, there are 3 networking specific attributes. One of the type network plugin, which today, according to the documentation, can have 2 values, enumerated values, Kubernetes and Azure, and both will not fit to our requirements. And the second talks about the network overlay. By default, it takes overlay, which is okay for us. And the third one talks about the policy. According to the documentation, the one permissible enumerated value is Calico. So by looking at that document, we thought of like this CAPZ way of templatization or YAML way of writing works for us. But if you suggest like stop doing that and go for ASO, then we have to further do some exploration from our side.
Yeah, so to be clear, the ASO API everything is exactly the same. It's just a slightly different YAML data structure, but there is no difference. There's no integral difference. Whether or not you're using the the Azure Managed Cluster API, the sort of legacy API or the new ASO API, you're still building a CAPC management cluster that installs all the ASO resources onto it. We're still leveraging ASO to do the work of creating the actual AKS cluster. The difference is that the ASO API gives you full access to the AKS feature set, with the trade-off cost of having to learn a slightly different API data structure, but it's all the exact same. So I don't know the cluster CTL generate ramifications of this, but for your advanced use case, I would not rely on cluster CTL generate, because you're clearly wanting to customize things for a very specific environment, which is great. I also am not confident that the legacy Azure Managed Cluster or Azure Managed Control Plane data structure exposes the things you were enumerating. I'm not sure it exposes the BYO story to the full extent of its evolution in AKS. So I would just make a strong recommendation based on your use case, that you want to do this initial work now to understand how that ASO API works in CAPC to grant you full access to the AKS APIs. That will be the best predictor of future success for your use case.
Understood. And the very specifics which I was looking for, is there any documentation, even outside that call also, that is also fine. If you can make us read what are the allowed values that this particular specific attributes network plugin can accept. Today we had seen Kubernetes and Azure, so that none, we setting to none, somehow the AKS cluster, the managed cluster is getting provisioned when we go to the Azure portal. But it is not certainly not in ready states. The overlay becoming none, the network plugin becoming none, and policy is also none. And we are hoping high with that state of the AKS managed cluster being provisioned or semi-provisioned, if that's the correct lingo. Whether we, manually installing the Calico plugin on top of it may work or not. So we are in a dicey state, but then we thought of like checking with you all, what is the permissible value? Can we set to none? Is that a guesswork we are doing? It may fail later, or is there any documentation we can read through? We are not convinced by we using the none.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the first thing that you need to do is just get rid of Cluster API and CAPC and find the AKS configuration that works for you. And then bring those requirements into CAPC to make sure that CAPC fulfills them. So I would start with AKS, figure out how to build an AKS cluster that accommodates bring your own CNI, and then install the CNI that you desire, stress test that, get that to a point where you know that it works. That would be for me, that would be my initial phase, is prove that I can actually build an AKS cluster that fulfills my requirements before you start worrying about scaling hundreds of them. So once you have a known working AKS configuration, then you can do that translation into ASI and CAPZ to leverage the cluster API features of being able to manage all those clusters at scale on a single pane of glass. But the first thing is really to figure out that your scenario actually even works in AKS. That's the lowest hanging fruit as far as I can see it right now.
Understood.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Jack. And can I go for the second question?
Sure.
Okay. Let's say be it cluster of the type management or of the type workload, where this management will be looking to provision many such workload cluster. Essentially, at the Azure level, both are of the type AKS as a PaaS service. Now, when we are looking to have this entire system implemented, where in a particular environment, let's say a dev environment or production environment, we'll have this one instance of management cluster, which is essentially a AKS cluster. We'll be creating these at a company's network level. What we are learning is this management cluster will be in one network zone, which have its own constraints. But the workload cluster, let's say 30 workload cluster, which will actually hold the workloads of the type services, secrets, config maps, the actual application which will be running in these workload cluster, will not essentially be sitting in the same network zone where the management cluster had created these. It will be in separate network zone at a networking level. And the flavors of those network zones, the company started, coming up with one could be untrusted, second could be semi-trusted, the other one could be trusted. So we are looking to understand if this management cluster is being given a responsibility to create these many workload cluster by using the CAPZ based cluster CTL generated template, and that gets used to provision this workload cluster via automated pipeline, manually running that command. Does this CAPZ command to work and have this workload cluster created, these two disparate zone-based AKS cluster communication at a network level requires VNet peering? Is that a mandate from the CAPZ point of view? Is this a technical necessity? Or
So I suspect that the VNet, you can set up the VNet peering ahead of time. I'm not confident. I mean, I probably need to just dig into it. I'm not sure if CAPZ is going to be able to do all of the VNet peering that you need for you, but I'm confident that you're able to define an AKS cluster with bring your own VNet requirements, and that if that VNet sits in a peered network to the management cluster, then the communication will be flowing.
yeah, I was under same.
So if it's a completely different network that doesn't have peering, I'm not confident that CAPI and CAPZ can do that on your behalf.
Yeah, if I may,
right now.
Yeah, I was under same impression, Jack, and we are not expecting CAPZ to take the responsibility of creating these VNets. My question was, given these two, workloads, AKS cluster management and workload cluster, two separate different zone, whether CAPZ has a technical prerequisite to have the two network VNet peered, and only then the CAPZ thing will work. Is that a hard requirement, or do you foresee those calls from within CAPZ or cluster CTL command? Those commands will fail, devoid of any, cross network peered with each other, or
Cluster API and CAPZ don't care about Azure VNet peering. They simply care about having a communication path to the configured IP address spaces. So they sit at an abstraction layer on top of what VNet peering accommodates.
Okay.
So CAPZ, when it's building a workload cluster, it expects that the API server endpoint that results from that outcome. So in the case of building an AKS cluster, CAPZ accepts a full declarative spec that defines the configuration for that AKS cluster. And then the CAPZ infrastructure resource that fulfills the cluster API contract eventually is populated with an API server endpoint, which is the canonical place to communicate with that workload cluster. So the assumption there, the expectation, the requirement is that the management cluster that built that workload cluster has access to that API server endpoint.
Okay. So the VNet pairing.
Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, the management cluster also, it needs network access to Azure in order to carry out work. But in terms of the,
is there any very specific port requirement to be sufficed for these calls, cluster CTL based? I like to believe underlying these are using the raw Microsoft provided RESTful API of Azure, like Terraform does that. So in order those calls to get executed behind the scene when we run the cluster CTL command or kubectl command, does it require any port thing to be opened from within the management cluster's realm of things? Apart from, should I ask, apart from 443?
No.
Okay.
Apart from the port that is exposed is the one that the API server endpoint exposes, no.
I see. Okay. Okay. I think I am good, Jack and Matt. This was very helpful.
Cool. Thank you for asking questions. Does anyone else have any other Questions, or should we pop back to Milestone? All right, let's do that. David, I assume these are ones you want to visit?
Yeah.
Cannot reconcile cube with local accounts disabled if identity is provided. Oh. Running CAPZ and EKS. Right on. New client because the client secret is empty. Huh. All right. Should we just put it on the milestone? Does seem pretty germane. Next. AKS automatic authentication failure. Oh, AKS automatic. All right.
If no one has any ideas, then I guess we'll just need needs triage. So for this one though, I don't know, we might want to have unless, I mean, if I don't know if we need more configuration set up, or is it clear enough where we could try and reproduce this?
If it's that simple, it shouldn't be hard to reproduce. If it's just AKS automatic.
Okay.
We can't reproduce anything because we don't have a working dev environment.
Well, that's also true.
We're working on that. It's worth making that public. So
yeah.
So
yeah, we're a little
public
stalled out.
PSA, we've been working for the past 2 months on migrating all Azure Kubernetes tests to a new SIG testing blessed community infrastructure environment. And somewhat coincident with that, we've also been working in Azure to meet newly heightened security requirements. So all this is to say, local development has been somewhat challenging for most of the summer at this point.
But there's a light at the end of that tunnel, I think. I almost got user assigned managed identity working this morning with Kind. Subscription and regional issues. So this is just a tracking issue for the capacity and other things allocation that we've been running into. It looks like it caused us to get rid of West US 3. Okay. Yeah, this is something we ought to close by the next milestone. So I think putting it there will give it more attention. Yep.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Anything else? You've got another questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Jack, I forgot to explicitly check with you on is there any possibility of we having the Calico specific installation plus configuration baked into the CAPZ generated cluster templates?
That is a good question. I would need to know more about how the flow works for shipping a BYO Calico to an AKS cluster. How do you deliver a self-provided network configuration to an AKS cluster?
Whatever extent I have researched on the official CAPZ 6 IO documentation, there is a section 1.4 add-ons which actually addresses this point, which says, let's say Calico or Funnel or any third-party tools, binaries to be installed. The documentation starts with instructing we to go to these third-party websites, have their binaries downloaded. If they provide the help chart, great, have that added and installed. So it
That makes
seems,
sense.
yeah, it seems
So
like
there's potentially a way to answer this, which is to say that if there's a Helm chart, or if you're able to create a Helm chart, you can use the project also under SIG cluster lifecycle called cluster API provider. Actually, I'm not sure what it expands to. It's colloquially known as CAPH, CAAPH.
okay,
And what that does is defines in YAML a it's a thin wrapping around a Helm chart definition that gets installed on the workload cluster
awesome.
or many workload clusters. It does label matching against the clusters. So if you create a YAML spec of your AKS cluster and you give it a cluster label, and then you create a CAPH spec that points to, or for each Helm chart that you need to install, you create a CAPH resource with the Helm configuration and you give it the matching cluster label. Then what CAPZ and Cluster API will do is they'll create the workload cluster, and then they will, after the workload cluster is finished, install the Helm chart. I'm not sure that's actually an ordered operation, but it will eventually reconcile. And so once the cluster is ready to receive work, CAPH will carry out the work of installing Helm on that workload cluster,
Awesome. It seems
installing the
very
Helm chart.
promising. Yeah, but it seems very promising and okay, great. I see. And what is the, I mean, official website link for this add-on provider for health thing?
I think if you Google Kubernetes CAPH, you'll get it.
Okay.
Oh, actually, you don't. Let's see here. Am I spelling it wrong? No, I'm not.
All right, I typed it here. I think this is actually correct. Let's see, how do I turn that into the URL? Is that right? Yes.
There it is.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. And generic question, Jack, like I was attending this last week's call also, and
Yep.
in such answering of yours to my question, you did also recommend to go and understand the ASO. So, is there an intent from the CAPZ team, the product team, whosoever right now choosing to use the CAPZ should stop and try to get onto the ASO way of creating the Azure resources, I mean the cluster resources, because possibly sooner or later the CAPZ supportability or whatnot can be, I mean, seized. I mean, is that the intent, or why you recommend to go and learn ASO, and if there is a new cluster provisioning thing, better to go for ASO? What's the underlying intent, so that it will help us to convince my team?
I can answer that. I mean the ASO managed API is the direction we're trying to take moving forward, simply because or there's numerous reasons, but the main one is that just the velocity of features for AKS is far too great for us to try and code every single feature back into CAPZ. And so this really makes it so that you can keep very quickly with minimal code changes on our side to have access to everything under the AKS API.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So that's absolutely correct what David said. There's actually there was some prior work that we did for ASO that sort of supported these opinions about how to best provide AKS for CAPZ customers. And that prior work is that ASO is much better at providing the continual Azure support for building any Azure infrastructure. So ASO is a sort of equivalent project to the various auto-generated SDKs that the Azure SDK team provides.
Right.
But ASO is Kubernetes native and carries out eventual consistency. So prior to CAPZ using it, so CAPZ has been using ASO for a year or so. Prior to CAPZ using ASO, it was responsible for manually implementing eventual consistency in Kubernetes for various Azure resources, and it was per resource. So for every resource, CAPZ would be responsible for connecting to the appropriate Azure SDK using Go and carrying out eventual consistency for those resources according to the declarative spec in the CAPZ configuration. ASO does all that for us across every single CAPZ resource. Every single Azure resource that we care about.
Got it.
And so it was seen as strategically it was a kind of obvious strategic advantage if we were able to unlock that integration with ASO. And it took a while, but we invested time to get to ASO. So for the long term, it greatly improves the stability and reliability of CAPZ connecting to Azure as Azure APIs themselves move forward, whether it's if you're in a self-managed environment and you're using VMs and load balancers and disks and networks, every single one of those Azure resource primitives requires some type of plumbing from CAPZ to communicate hygienically with Azure. And every single one of those resources maintains their own service API that moves forward at a fairly frequent cadence, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. And so that's a lot of work for the CAPZ project to manually do across all of its sets of resources. And the fact that we're doing it somewhat manually, according to we're humans trying to fulfill an Azure and we're trying to fulfill the plumbing between an Azure API contract and a cluster API contract. We're sitting in the middle as CAPZ. So it introduces more opportunity for human error and edge cases. So pinning to a Kubernetes native auto-generated SDK offers tons of advantages for the project and for users along all those dimensions I've described. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So it's certainly not a signal of CAPZ project peeling off. There you go. That's not what's happening at all.
Got it.
The Cluster API and CAPZ provide very important value proposition for these stories. So ASO is a very valuable, useful sort of primitive for something like Cluster API because it provides the necessary Kubernetes native resource specs and controllers to carry out work on behalf of Azure infrastructure requests. But for managing clusters, now we have to compose sets of ASO resources together. So that's something that Cluster API is doing as part of its native behavioral contract. And additionally, it allows us to, once we've formed those rational sets, we can now create hundreds of those clusters. So ASO does not solve for that problem. So Cluster API and CAPZ are providing tons of value, but it didn't make sense for CAPZ and ASO to do that, basically carry out the same work for the subset of resources that CAPZ cared about. And the reason we did that was the case 2 years ago is because the CAPZ project predated ASO being GA, as far as I can tell. So it made all the sense in the world for CAPZ to adopt ASO. It just was hard, and so it took us a bunch of initial upfront capital investment, if you will, to do that work. But now that we've done that work, it has the effect of making CAPZ much more reliable and durable in the long term.
Got it. So in that case, the questions that I posed today, Calico and all, that can also, I like to believe, has some sort of objects or resources exposed from within the set of ASO-based APIs.
No, sorry. ASO isn't going to handle Calico for you. ASO is going to handle the AKS configuration for you. So whatever AKS configuration you need that declares, I want to bring my own CNI, ASO will handle that for you. And if that's a new feature and the API version of ASO that CAPZ has doesn't expose that, and CAPZ has to leap to a new version of ASO, definitely tell us, and then we can book that work. That sort of manual maintenance is still required for CAPZ going forward, but it's a lot less work than what was in the past.
Yeah, but
so
then
all ASO is involved in is exposing the AKS configuration. Once you get your AKS cluster built with the configuration you desire, in your case, it's an AKS cluster without a working CNI, and then you are going to install your CNI later.
Right.
That is not an ASO story. That's hopefully, in the best case scenario, that's like a Helm install story on an AKS cluster that's waiting for CNI to be installed.
which is fine, but like you provided one way out of cap Z reaching out to cap H to internally call the Helm, and the Calico specific binaries will get installed one after another once the cluster provision is being done responsibly by CapZ, and then the CapH will take over its responsibility to apply the Helm on it, by virtue of which I will get an AKS cluster with my Calico. So CapZ calling the CapH, this sort of communication, shouldn't that also be there in any of the, publicized objects under ASO? It's just one object or sub objects calling another objects, but essentially that leaf objects has to rely on Helm only. And that Helm way of installing the Calico, we are not expecting neither from CapZ, nor from CapH, neither from ASO as well. That will still rely on these third-party network plugin like projects like Calico and all. That will stay with them only. But calling from one to another objects and then reaching out to the Helm and using it and applying it, that sort of thing, that what cap H can solve, shouldn't that also be solved by any of the objects in ASO?
I have to admit I don't understand. My default answer is no, but I don't quite understand what you're asking.
Is there any counterpart of CapH in ASO?
No. So ASO is the scope of ASO is to represent native Azure service APIs in a Kubernetes native CRD. That's really the scope.
Okay.
So ASO represents an Azure VM. ASO represents an Azure NAT gateway, an Azure VNet. All of those Azure resources that are native to Azure and have canonical APIs, ASO implements those canonical APIs in a Kubernetes native declarative spec, i.e. a CRD.
Okay.
So ASO scope is for Azure.
Okay.
It has no concern with things like Helm charts or has no concern with Kubernetes itself. It simply implements an Azure infrastructure API lifecycle as a Kubernetes CRD.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I guess that answers for now all of my questions. Thanks so much, Jack, David, Matt. This was very helpful. I also read the articles which you all publish and go through as much as documentation, but then there are some questions which need some talking. So thanks for this.
Yeah, please. That's why we do this. There's a lot of moving parts here, so don't feel, and there's a large learning curve. We're not all over the top of it necessarily. Cool. If we don't have any more questions, we can hop back to issues, or we can call it good if nobody has any favorite issues to elevate. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in cap H there.
I think we only have like 3 minutes. I mean, I do think it would be good maybe later to just update the PR triage just like on the status like of ones that need review or not. Some of them seem a little questionable on where we're at with them, but I don't think we need to cover them here because we're out of time.
All right. Well, we can all make a commitment to run through the issues, although somehow that often doesn't happen. But let's do visit this before next week so we don't spend the entire time groveling through these. But all right then. Let's call it good until next week. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for bringing the questions. That was informative for all of us. And have a great Thursday. We'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, Matt.
You bet.
Thank you.